So I'm not going to impart any useful information, I think, unlike Clive. I'm just going to talk about a proposed survey that I've been working on with Claire and looking at getting some further input from yourselves on this topic. So I've nicked one of Clive's slides here. So clearly, HRA supports informed consent where informed consent is feasible and helpful. But there are times, I think, when most ethics committees acknowledge that it can be difficult. So there are scenarios, clearly we talked about emergency research, but there's other types of scenarios where it's not always possible or helpful or feasible to seek informed consent. So these are some of the examples. And occasionally studies do go through, although I think it'd be useful to review what we've looked at over the last few years. I don't think there's many drug trials where they're not seeking consent. But I think it'd be worth us reviewing what has been approved. So what we were thinking of doing, this is in the first round, was perhaps doing an online survey of the Research Ethics Committee members in England. We have 68 committees. They're not all flagged to look at clinical trials. Do you know how many of the 68 are? I don't know.
I don't know, sorry.
I don't know, maybe 20, I don't know.
Yeah.
But clearly, any of them could have an application for a TWIX approach, but only some of them will actually see clinical trials type or medicinal product type trials. So what we were thinking was that we could survey all the members online across the board and start to get some of their views and understanding of different types of scenarios where consent is either not sought or only sought in part, and try and dig down a bit in terms of looking at, I guess to some extent it might be an awareness, because I think for some of the members they might be completely unaware of some of these trial designs. So it's also a good way of getting the message out that these things exist, actually, I think is a way to all the membership. And asking them to come on 5 scenarios, which I'm going to work through now. But the idea that Claire and I have had is whether we can roll this out internationally and perhaps do an international survey of ethics committee members across the board. So we're looking for interest here.
Does that include Scotland?
It could well do, yes. Yeah. We can't speak for Scotland.
That's a political question. Let's not go there, right?
Yeah, no. We might well want to do it across the whole of the UK, but we'd have to sign up our partners to that. So we were starting off with a scenario of a traditional RCT. So one of the key questions is, what is it that we're actually testing? I think at the moment in our draft, we're just talking about a trial of antihypertensives. And I do wonder about that one, because I think if we're saying that part of the justification in the later scenarios for not seeking consent is you don't want to distress people by inviting them into a traditional RCT, and then they're disappointed because they don't get the intervention arm. I'm not quite sure that applies to antihypertensives, because people don't necessarily take them because they're seeking a cure and feeling particularly ill. So I don't know. I think we have to think very carefully about what the scenarios are and what the particular situation is that we're using. So one of the things that James suggested it was that we use the same scenario behind the scenes, so that these would all be for not necessarily the antihypertensive one, but whichever one we use would be the same one in each of these study designs. And I think that's something else we need to think about, whether that's actually practical or not. I'll come back to that. So cluster trial design was definitely one of the designs we wanted to look at. And I don't know, I think at the moment we've got no consent. I think we're a little bit unhappy about that one from the HRA perspective, because that doesn't necessarily fit with our guidance, where we're suggesting there should be consent, but proportionate consent. But maybe we could test both options. And again, I think some of that might depend on whether we're talking about a drug here or a different type of intervention. And then the other thing to think about if there's no consent is the data, because the REC members, certainly in England, are very hot on data protection. And I could see them saying no to lots of these if they thought there wasn't consent for use of data. So we need to think about consent for data, even if we're not talking about consent for the intervention. And that complicates things. So scenario 3 would be a Zealand design. Now, I have seen some Zealand designs go through the ethics committees. They don't go through very often. And the ones I've seen tend to be where it's not a drug and the intervention is difficult to blind, or there is no standard care, and therefore the people in the control arm might feel deprived because they're not being offered the intervention. So I think it's worth us thinking again, what do we really want from this particular scenario? Does it have to be a drug comparison, or could it be a different type of intervention, perhaps? Clearly there are some drug interventions where there is no standard care, or where there is no, or where it may be difficult to blind. So those are the things we want to think about. And then we've still got the data issue. If there's no consent for the intervention, can there still be consent for the data? But I think we talked about some of those designs yesterday where we could have, is it a double? Is that right, double Zealand? Where we could have consent for data, if not for the intervention. And then we want to move into finally ending with the Twix example. So we'd have the full one where they're consented for all these things up front, which is the type A. And then the type B, where we take out some of those elements and look at the ethics committee's views towards taking out those elements. I think they do need quite a lot of explanation, and we're hopefully going to be working on some flowcharts. We saw some lovely flowcharts yesterday that I think we might be able to, to borrow for some of this, that really beautifully describe what these things are. Because I think if you don't know what a Twix is and you haven't come across one before, they are potentially quite confusing. So we need to explain them very, very well, I think, to the ethics committee members, so they actually understand what it is we're talking about. The other thing that occurred to me yesterday, but this isn't very helpful on an international front, was whether we should have a Section 251 example in England. So for those of you outside of the UK, Section 251 allows researchers to apply to use data, personal identifiable data, without consent. And there's a special committee that approves that type of study. So I don't know if it's worth putting that in. We also did have an emergency example, didn't we, earlier, which we could consider putting back in.
Could you give an example of a study that was approved under Section
251? Yeah. They tend not to be, they're not trials usually, but they're usually data gathering. So when we had the CJD episode where young people were dying of CJD, they wanted to take samples of tonsils from, I think, all the children in London when their tonsils were removed, and analyse them for CJD prions, but without telling the parents or the children that this was happening. And that was ethically reviewed as well, and it was agreed that it wasn't in the interest to tell people that was happening. Or because also they wouldn't know what to do with the results. What do we do with the results if we know they've got the prions? In fact, I think there were none. There are, they have to be in the public good to be justifiable, and there has to be no other way of doing it. But that's so peculiar to the UK. I'm not sure that's useful. So we want, I guess, really scenarios that will work across the board if we're going to have consistency and do this on an international basis. So yeah, one of the big questions for me is, should these all be scenarios involving drugs? I think the drugs is useful, but does have sort of different legal implications in different countries. And maybe, I don't know if there's room to do one of each in each scenario, a drug one and a different type of intervention, perhaps. Because I think that people's attitudes could be different, depending on whether it's a drug or a different type of intervention. Do we need to build up justifications more clearly for why consent wouldn't be sought in different scenarios? Do we need some of the scenarios to be slightly more serious, where patients really want the treatment or would feel deprived if they were in the control arm? We need to think about the data. Yes, and how we collect data where there's absolutely no consent. But I think we covered that yesterday. So would there be interest from some of you in taking part?
Yes. Hi, Mark. Is this your last slide?
Yeah, I think it is, yeah.
Okay, then I'll start with some suggestions.
Yeah.
Maybe the first question, would there be interest?
Yes.
I think, I mean, I'm not in a medical ethical committee, but I think this is definitely something that we can suggest. Because in Utrecht, there's a lot of interest from our ethical people in these types of questions. So we will definitely discuss that. Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's not necessarily straightforward to get permission to do that straight away, but we could perhaps support that if we're writing letters of support, and that would presumably help. So.
Comments first.
I think maybe a suggestion. I think because indeed, I think when you think about drug trials, there are two issues there. One is that the regulations are a little bit more strict when it comes to drug trials, and also the mindset of people judging these drug trials is also quite different. But I would suggest using an intervention that is already approved, a CMRCT intervention that is already approved in some of the centers. So you already know that it's going through, that an IRB will approve it, and then you could test that type of intervention in your in this study.
So I think this is a great idea. I would make it bigger, and I think. So I think you mentioned, well, lots of people are invited to take part in it. So lots of ethics committees. I think you should randomise what you present to people. So I think it's absolutely essential that you ask people about drugs. I think it's absolutely essential that you ask people about interventions other than drugs, unless you are only interested in one or the other. I wouldn't, at the first instance, refer to the design at all in the scenarios. I wouldn't say, Sean wants to do a Zealand design and then explain it. I would present the design minus the names. I don't think the names are. So if Zealand, for example, I think is particularly interesting in that I think there's it's a prejudiced term. I think it comes with some baggage.
I think it's right about Zealand. Twix, I think.
Well, who knows? So I would describe the design, but not give them labels,
That's interesting.
unless for some reason you think that's important. And so I think it's a great idea. I think the scenarios need to be very carefully worded. I think it's essential. There's drugs, there's non-drugs, and potentially types of drugs along the line of what we've just heard. One that's already licensed, one that's actually this is a sort of registration type of drug. And then one last point is I've heard this term a few times about those who get randomised to the comparator arm might feel deprived. I push that a bit and say, how do you know? I mean, maybe they don't. So I've been involved in trials where I think it would be fair to say there's disappointment, but if we think of retention in the comparison arm compared to the intervention arm, it was better in the comparison arm than it was in the intervention arm, because what we offered was, well, you'll get it next time. They sort of had a ticket to get it. So I would query that assumption as being obviously always the case. So that's something to think about as well. And the last point, then I will shut up, is I think it's important to be very clear yourselves as to why you are doing it. So what will be done with the information that comes out. And I think you could make this into a really, really good piece of work, but I would make it as big as you can possibly make it.
And you mentioned randomization. How do you see?
So I think the scenarios you could get here, you could have 20, given the drugs and the different designs. And if you sent a survey to a member of an ethics committee with 20 scenarios on, if it was me, I wouldn't do it. Why? I mean, I've got lots of other things to do. So what I think you would do is each individual might see 5, but they will not see the same 5 as everybody else. So the scenarios they receive are randomized. And that's why you need to make it bigger, because clearly you need each scenario to be put in front of enough people to be able to conclude something meaningful from what you get back.
And why just ask the ethics?
Indeed, indeed.
About the likes of research design services I work for the and I think it would be interesting to involve research design services, NIH maybe.
You mean use researchers as respondents? Yeah.
So, and the reason is the difference.
Yes, that would.
I think would be really interesting.
On a drug trial, just to think about not just a straightforward randomised controlled trial, but an enhanced enrichment design, because that at least allows all the patients to have a go at the drug, and they're only randomised after they've been a responder to the open study, and those have been approved. I've had one of those approved. There's more evidence to suggest that that might stop this problem of patients feeling that they've got the wrong arm, because they all get a chance at using the drug.
So that might depend on the condition that we specify. Yeah.
Last question?
I think it's also important to try to find out why people respond as they do, because one of the reasons that the cell design has got some bad critique is that sometimes people have chosen it explicitly because they knew that people wouldn't consent. And that seems to be sort of a, if that is the reason that some people might think it is an acceptable design, that seems somewhat problematic.
Yes. So do you think there needs to be a justification for each design? We need to build in the justification.
Well, I mean, I guess
No justification. Well, there needs to be some precedents who try to find out why do people find this particular scenario acceptable or unacceptable.
I was just going to say that a survey might not be the best method either, because committees always make decisions as committees. So if you're sending it to, so it depends how they're going to answer it. If you're sending it to individuals,
We'll
within
send
the
it to
committee,
individuals. Yeah, we don't want a committee decision. I don't think we.
Right.
Yeah, but that doesn't really, I agree with
Doesn't
you.
reflect the ethics
life
process,
situation.
does it?
well, so you could do a very clever you could do a very clever study by sneaking in to a real committee.
Shall we just leave that? We're going to talk later about the fact that we do something called SHED, which is shared ethical debate, and where we've got a topic where we want to see consistency, we actually take a real application, send it to multiple committees. It's probably already been approved in one place already. They mostly think, although sometimes they work it out, that it's a real application, and we then compare the results of all the different committees and then go back.
Ethical.
Yeah. Nobody is home.
Final question.
So I want to echo what Sean said and then pose a potential outcome. And the point was, why are you doing it? How will you use the data? I think that's obviously central to this whole endeavor. I've heard so far that people have run into difficulty explaining their design and getting approval from their committees. So the idea that you could give written brief descriptions to the extent that people can understand it well enough so you can elicit a valid response that you can use and be confident about, I would think through it very carefully, because there is potential for this project backfiring if your intention is hoping to get really valid response from people who truly understand. Because most surveys, when we design them, we always think about how we are thinking about it when we design it. We've spent 2 days, or we're going to spend 2 days, and some of you have thought about this for years. The people who are going to read it, they will see it for the first time. It will be strange. And then when things are strange, that dysphoria translates into, this must be risky. So I think that you have to be, I'm a little worried about potential outcome. If I would pre-test this to make sure, and really do it thoroughly, to see even if you can get people to get into the mindset that we think they need to be in to make this decision. Because I'd be a little bit worried.
Yeah, I do think we need to take our time and get it right.